The Pharaoh is the heart of Egypt. The land is its body, and the people are its blood.
Back in the old days, when you couldn't throw a stick without hitting a good city building game, usually an Impression Games title, Impression Games made quite a lot of these, games. City builders, historic city builders, the ones that let you just create Rome, that let you build Athens and let you plan out all those marvelous cities that spread across the Nile. That was Pharaoh. The last one was a game called Pharaoh, released in 1999, and it's probably the best one of the bunch. Now, keep in mind that when I'm saying it's the best, I'm not necessarily referring to it in terms of the refinement of the mechanics. I've only played the Impression games up until Zeus. I had never played the last one, Rise of the Middle Kingdom, and Zeus does make things a bit more playable. And when I say playable, I mean a bit more easy, a bit more casual, if you will. It's because it handles workforce distribution a lot more directly. You don't have to place a building that needs workers right next to a house, because people will just go to work when they need to. The workplace doesn't have to come and go get them. And I like Zeus quite a lot, but Pharaoh does something that I believe Caesar and Zeus never quite managed. Namely, they owned their setting. Now, what do I mean by this? You could argue that after Caesar, everything is just a reskin. It's the same game with slightly tweaked mechanics, but in a different setting and time period. And you wouldn't be wrong, especially if you compare Caesar to Zeus. Now, while sure, Zeus has a more pronounced supernatural element with the gods actually coming down and moving around and fighting, and there being monsters and heroes, but that just seems like a bit of a, I wouldn't say gimmick, but it doesn't feel as central to the game as the thing that Pharaoh had. What thing? Well, the Nile, of course. You can't talk about Egypt without the Nile. Its yearly floods gave life. It gave nourishment. It is the reason why Egypt was such a massive, advanced and influential culture. The Nile gave you food. Well, it gave you irrigation and you could use that to grow food, but you could depend on it. You could be sure that next year there will be a flood. It will let you grow crops on a regular basis. You didn't have to move around. You didn't have to scavenge or hunt. You could grow crops, harvest them, process them, and in the meantime, oh yeah, what was that thing? Right, advance human civilization beyond its meager beginnings. Develop mathematics, develop astronomy, and methods of building that you could argue were never actually matched. I mean, look at those goddamn pyramids. They're amazing and you could build them in-game. Pharaoh owned the theme. It felt like you were in Egypt. Everything you did depended on the Nile. On that flood, you would play around that yearly flood, hoping that the harvest would be good enough for you to expand your city, to build that ancient metropolis that would be remembered age after age as one of the greatest ever made. And the single player campaign reinforced that. You didn't just play one person, you played dynasties. It gave you a sense of continuity, a sense of progression, passage of time. What I'm getting at is that this game had amazing fluff. Fluff is what we usually call the stuff that gets us into the game, that gets us immersed, that gets us there, makes us not necessarily stay, but encourages us to stick around. Of course, it didn't hurt that in terms of gameplay, Pharaoh was amazing. It was a clear improvement from Caesar 3. Now, if you haven't played these games yet, first, how dare you? And two, I'm sorry I haven't been all that clear about what exactly these games imply. Like what you do in win them? Well, you start off with a map, an empty lot usually, a big one, and you start planting down houses and roads and waiting for people to come and live in those houses. And after that, you build all sorts of buildings for those people. You build an architect's post to make sure that their houses don't crumble. You build a fire station to make sure it doesn't catch fire, or if it does, that there's someone there to put it out. You build doctors, you build entertainment, you build, well, that's mostly to let them not burst into flames and not die of malaria or boredom, but most of all, you build a robust as possible economical chain, or industrial chain, it would be better said. You need food, and you usually can't import it. Well, you can, but it requires some resources, and you do it a lot later in the missions. You have the Nile, you have to build farms on the Nile. You then need work camps filled with people that will work those farms after the flood. You will need people to carry that food, you will need people in the storage yards to handle it, you will need markets to sell the food to the people, you will need an amazing array of infrastructure. It's sort of like Settlers but deeper, less casual, more hardcore, and at times quite difficult, because planning a city requires you to fully understand the buildings, what they're capable of, how big they are, where they need to be placed, because some buildings require water, and guess what? You're in a desert for most of the time, a very arid region, so there won't be a lot of water unless you redirect it from the Nile or are lucky enough to find some oasis. You also have the gods to tend to, because they can get very pissy if you don't worship them. They'll start stealing your food, they'll demolish your buildings, they'll make everyone hate you. But if you do get them to like you by worshipping them, by building temples, by hosting festivals in their name, they'll be nice, they'll give you things. They won't destroy you, which is always a big plus. That sort of describes, well, apart from the Nile bit, every game in this saga made by Impression Games. But it also had one more thing. Well, they all had one more thing. They had combat. A very rudimentary and not very good mode of combat, which honestly I try to skip as much as possible, always choosing the more economy-focused campaigns and not the military ones, because the military ones were just kind of meh. I never enjoyed them. These games do not excel at combat. They probably did it about as bad as Settlers 3 did, and 4, and Knights and Merchants. Settlers 2 was actually okay with combat, mostly because you didn't actually do much in it, and that's probably the best way to handle one of these games. You don't do much in combat. You barely have to spend the resources on it, just build a generic combat focused thing and let it go. But in these games you actually had separate buildings for soldiers, they were usually nobility, they needed equipment, they needed an organization, they needed your command, it wasn't really that good. Thankfully, you could skip it for most of the time, and you could focus on the true pleasure of this game. Not just building your city, but building monuments. The monuments in this game just blew everything else away. The temples of Zeus were nothing compared to the pyramids you could build in this thing. Oh sure, the pyramids you started with were actually not pyramids, they were mastabas. They were temples, they were small burial mounds, but in time, as you traverse the ages, from the old kingdom to the new one, to the newer one, to Cleopatra's one, you would build monuments so magnificent, so superb, that were you to play this game on, I believe, 800 by 600 or 640 by 480, which were the standard resolutions you would play them back in the day, you could probably not actually build them, because they tended to have some requirements, like a big pyramid needed to be directed towards the water, it needed to have a shaft going from it to the water, to a flowing to the Nile, but they were so big you usually could not see its edges on a smaller resolution, so placing them tended to be a challenge, a big one. And building them would take you hours of real well, not hours, it would take you days. The big ones would probably take you days unless you specialize the city so much for just building that one gigantic pyramid that you could do it in just a few hours. They needed resources, like tons of resources, tons of stone that needed to be carved out of the ground, and you could see it being built. And that's what I liked about it so much. You could see it being planned. You could see them flood the area with water so they could carve out stones. You could see them erect something magnificent using the most rudimentary tools. It sold the theme. It sold you on the idea of Egypt completely. And honestly, Zeus never did that. It sold me on the fantasy of, well, you know, Hercules and Xena were very popular back then. It sold me on the Olympian legends, not necessarily Greece itself. Though the game was called Zeus, even though you weren't a god, it was a bit counterintuitive, that title. But in Pharaoh, well, yeah, you weren't a pharaoh, but you could become one, I believe. Well, not you, but not your character, the one you started out as, but the later ones. I believe they could become Pharaoh one day, someday. And as for Caesar, well, combat was a much bigger part of Rome than a game made by Impression could actually hope to properly display. And it also had a very complicated political system which the Impression games never had. Sadly, I can't make this show on exactly the anniversary of Pharaoh, but I am very close. Pharaoh was released on the 31st of October 1999, 17 years ago. And it still looks amazing, especially if you install the updates, well, not the updates, the community patches that give it support for high resolutions. They may break the interface from time to time, but still, the result is a game that is just splendid, superb, magnificent even. As always, I encourage you to play this game. You can find it along with Cleopatra, the expansion that adds Cleopatra and, you know, the other kingdom, on GOG right now for the price of €9. This, again, even though it's a bit more hardcore, or kind of a lot more hardcore than Settlers 2, is still a very beautiful and relaxing game. It's a calming game. It's one that lets you solve problems. It's one that lets you enjoy the results of your work. Because just seeing that pyramid go up, just seeing that temple being built bit by bit, that's pure pleasure right there. That's beauty. And sadly, that's about all you're gonna get out of this genre. There was a more recent game like this called Lettuce, which takes inspiration from the Impression Games era of city builders, which is on Steam and it appears to be quite enjoyed by people, but I haven't played it. And there should have been another one. There should have been a game called Medieval Mare. Right after Tilted Mill announced that game, I rushed to request an interview with Chris Beatrice, the lead designer of Pharaoh, of Zeus, and of Medieval Mare, and I talked to him about why haven't there been so many medieval city builders like this one? And he said, well, I don't know, because it would be a really good setting. Because all those games had in common one thing. You were acquiring knowledge. You were building something from nothing. And medieval ages, that's basically what you do. I mean, all the knowledge of the past was lost, and you had to find it again, to rebuild it, to improve, to construct something that would last ages. And we got to talking about walker systems and multiplayer and possibilities and other things, but sadly, that game never was released. Development for it was halted after a year or so, right before the Kickstarter craze began. If you're interested in that interview, look up Medieval Mare on Wikipedia and you'll find the link to my interview with Chris Beatrice. Hopefully, Tilted Mill will come back to it one day, because I sure as hell want there to be more games like this. Ones that, like Pharaoh, completely embrace their theme. Thank you for watching this show. If you enjoyed it, please consider watching some of our other videos and maybe sharing them or giving a thumbs up if you feel like it. And if you really liked what you saw, please check out our Patreon page. For just $1 a month, you could help us make much better shows and get some rewards in the process. Or you could consider buying my book called Tale of Doom. Volume 1 is out now and available for just $2. And as always, if you thought it was horrible, you know where to find me and complain about it.